30 years now. But I was spending a lot of time looking at despair, depression, anxiety, suicidality, which has a lot of negative consequences because of the types of stuff I need to read all the time. But also, when you go to a party and you say, "What do you study?" "Oh, despair." You know, it's a bit of a Debbie Downer kind of thing. So I realized that I felt like I was making great progress because I started talking about remission from despair. And so remission from suicide, remission from depression. But is that really what I wanted to get at? Because what do I want for my kids, for myself, for my community? I don't want us just to be at neutral. So if I came up to Mark and I said, "How are you doing today?"
Pretty awful.
Yeah. Or how about "I'm not suicidal," right? That doesn't make me have a sense that I'm right where I want to get to. I don't want to just bring you up to not, life-threateningly ill. I want to bring you up into happiness and other aspects. So that's where this came from, and there's a bit of a journey, but I wanted to talk a little bit about public images. And first, actually, I want to just acknowledge my co-authors. So I'm going to talk about 3 different papers that we have going. The first one is about complete mental health in older adult, and I want to thank Bailey Hollister, who's one of our former MSW students here, and David Burns, my colleague, who's a professor in social work here at U of T. We're working together on that paper. Then I have one on complete mental health among older immigrants I'm going to talk to, and Hong Mei Tong, who's now prof in Edmonton and was a postdoctoral fellow when we started working on it. And then also with one of our doctoral students in social work, Philip Baden, we're looking at people who were formerly suicidal. So many thanks to all of my lovely colleagues. So these are kind of the images we get, right? Midlife crisis just ahead, or Freedom 55. Which is it? What could it be? Do you know this quote by Betty David? "Old age ain't no place for sissies." And then the other idea is we don't want to be old. We want to pretend that we're young. So this all started by my search for inspiring older women. So I was taking our up year, and my younger daughter was just going into high school. So I said, I want to find women who can be role models for you. And I'm looking in the public record. We went to every museum there was. You know what? It's silent. 500, 800 years of history is basically silent about women in general and older women in particular. And I was looking for something in particular. So there are some famous queens and stuff, but I wanted to have people who were invested in social relationships and had functional children. And, I didn't just want to have people that excelled in 1 or 2 things. So we did a little bit of a Marie Curie thing, and we went to where she was buried, and we went to where she was born. And, she had positive relationships with her children. Both daughters and one son-in-law got the Nobel Prize as well as she and her husband. So they've done a ton. But in general, there was a lot of gap there. So I spent a lot of time trying to find this. And here's some people in the public record. Does anyone know who this is? Maggie Smith. And how old is she? Do you have any idea?
I think she's in her 80s.
Yeah, she's 81. She's still acting, and she's been acting since she was in her teens. All right, this one is trickier. Who's this? British?
Judy Jones?
No, the Queen Mum. It's interesting. I presented this to a community group of people over 80, and they were all in on that. They knew that. But anyway, she worked. She lived to 102, and she was still doing public openings, volunteer work within 2 months of when she died. She was also a very heavy consumer of alcohol, so she may have been a little pickled, but she was unbelievably committed to her work right until her death. And she had a good relationship with her kids. So. And who's this?
Hazel McCallion.
Yes. Hazel McCallion worked as a mayor for 36 years, only retiring at 93. And a geriatrician said, her gait is, 90, said, her gait is perfect, her mind is sharp, her diction is fantastic. She's a poster child for older adults. So and she also has a positive, raised kids and has a positive relationship with her children, and still does volunteer work. She still does her own housekeeping. She thinks it's good exercise, keeps her humble. So here's another, okay, 93, that's pretty old. How about this person? This is what Georgina Harwood was doing on her 100th birthday. There's a great quote from C.S. Lewis saying, "You're never too old to set another goal or to dream a new dream." But it took quite a toll on her, as you can imagine. So she had to rest 2 days, and then she went diving with sharks the next. So obviously most of us are not blessed with that level of physical fitness, but the idea of these inspirational women was something I was seeking for. You know, what does it look like to be in complete mental health, to be fully functioning in older adulthood? And I'm not diving with the sharks at half her age and have no intention of doing so, nor skydiving, but that idea. So many of us are lucky to have inspiring women in our lives, and I'm going to share those. This is my grandmother, who lived to be 93, and we traveled together, and she was sharp as a whip right to the end. She was a assistant nurse in the First World War, and then at the end they paid for her to go to schooling because she had to drop out in grade 8 because after grade 8 there was no schooling for women in Northern Ireland in this little village that she grew up in. But she got into community college or a polytechnic, and she became a social worker. So I'm a third generation social worker. And she married one of her patients who was 100% disabled in 1919. Always married your nurse. He lived to be 92. But he never worked again. So she supported the family, and both her daughters went to university. And this is my mom, who did her theology degree. She was only the second woman to do her theology degree back in the 50s. Because nobody was doing it because they weren't ordaining women for another 30 years. So she worked in social work for 30 years. And then at 55, she started her true profession, which was being an Anglican minister. She's 86, and she still volunteers 20 hours a week and gives about 7 sermons a month. So what are the lessons I learned from these so there's all this interaction of qualitative and quantitative. This is a qualitative study to figure out, what do I learn? So there tends to be an outward focus, a sense of purpose in life, physically active and energetic. Many are spiritual, strong sense of humor, tenacity, sticking to your goals, and investing in social relationships, particularly parenting. But now I've got these women that I found inspirational, but then I want to know, what does complete mental health look like in general? So this is not a rhetorical question. Think about how you want to be, or the people you know you think of as absolutely flourishing. What characteristics do they have? If you make eye contact, you're in. I'm going to ask you, Phyllis.
For stress.
Oh, so some way of coping with stress in a productive manner, so you don't get overwhelmed by it. Sure, Michael.
Yeah, they still have an inquiring mind, so they're looking.
So curiosity and
learning new things.
Yes, a passion for life. Absolutely.
To add to that, I was going to say engagement. Bless her heart, my grandmother is 97 this year, and she's so engaged. She asks questions. She wants to know what's going on. She texts. She's online.
Oh my God.
So, I look at her and I'm like, yes, I want to be like that when I'm 97. Should I live to that age?
So other focused and engaged and not intimidated by new developments, right? All of those are great things. Yes, what is that?
I was just going to say an attitude, like a positive attitude.
Okay, a sort of a can-do, but looking the glass half full kind of attitude, okay?
Yeah.
Anybody, any other comments?
Commitment to a cause.
Sense of purpose, a commitment, yes.
I don't know quite how to put this, but a way of relating to dying and to death that somehow not just pushing it away or denying it, but I mean, some of the older people I know who are very close to the threshold, they're ready to die, but at the same time, they're happy to be alive, as opposed to, I'm going to stay alive as long as I can and being very nervous about death. So that relationship to death and dying.
Oh, that's an interesting comment. So you're not fearful about death, but embracing that knowledge and living each day to the fullest that you have. That sort of idea?
Yeah, and being able to talk about it. And the reason I bring it up in this connection is because when people are fearful and negative about death, it does affect their mental health because it makes them very anxious and sort of clinging on to their health.
Okay.
Right.
So you're bringing, so complete mental health, let's just talk a little bit about mental illness. What if you have complete mental health, do you have mental illness? Are they the same thing? Is it just the absence? Is there more to it than that? What is it?
I think you can have mental illness and have complete mental health, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So I've been intrigued for a long time in the concept of health and promoting health. And what does that mean for somebody who has a terminal illness or who has serious physical disabilities?
Yeah, physical I'm okay with, but
right, so I want to translate that over. I'm just pushing myself here to think about it, because if a person is, for example, psychotic, let's take something very extreme, or somebody who has serious other issues like OCD or depression, anxiety type of things, can they, within the parameters of having that disease, still function in a way where you say that person has, you might not want to put that word complete because we don't know of mental health, given what their capacity is.
all right, so Michael, can we revisit this? Because I actually
sure
wouldn't,
can.
I would certainly put somebody with a chronic, even a palliative physical health condition,
Right.
It could well be in complete mental health. And we actually, I'm not reporting on it here, but we're looking at people, a subsample of people who have such extreme pain that it's interfering with almost every one of their daily activities. And again,
Can I just interrupt for a second? Maybe I didn't explain what this sort of analogy was. I'm talking about having, physical health, good physical health, or it's actually optimal physical health, given the limitations, physical limitations that a person has, including, terminal illness. So even though they've got cancer, even though they don't have long to live, then their physical health is optimal. So I'm looking for the parallel.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. Well, you can challenge me at the end, because I'm actually going to use the definition. So I actually think that complete mental health is, at least at the time being, it doesn't mean across your whole lifespan, but at the time being, you're not mentally ill. So you have no major depressive disorders. There's a whack-a-mole problem. Does anyone know what this game is?
Yeah.
Whack-a-mole? So basically it's a game where you hit down one little thing and another one pops up. I always had a sense that that's what my research was doing. So I was looking at people, this is not a big improvement, I mean a little bit of an improvement, or the addictions go down but the suicide comes up. And so the whack-a-mole problem is a problem with any of us who are working in siloed fields. Like if I'm only looking at depression, I need to think about their anxiety disorders, which could be also affecting their quality of life, and similarly bipolar, etc. So to deal with this whack-a-mole problem, a brilliant researcher in Emory University named Corey Keyes came up with a comprehensive piece. He said, okay, I'm interested not just in the absence of mental illness, but that's a starting point. So there's 3 aspects to this complete mental health piece, and I've bought in big time. I think this is a great way of thinking about complete mental health. So sure enough, in the last year, you cannot have a major depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, bipolar, drug or alcohol addictions, or suicidal thoughts. That you can't have that for the last year. You have to be clear of that, but that's not enough. You also, in the last month, they ask you, how often have you been happy? Is it daily, almost daily, 2 or 3 times a week, weekly, or less often, or never? And to make this level, you have to be daily or almost daily happy. Or they have the same question but around satisfaction. How often have you been satisfied with your health? You have satisfied with your life. You have to say daily or almost daily. So this is a really high level. As I said, if you've been happy once a week only, you don't make my cut, even if you have no mental illnesses. And then they have this great set of 11 questions about social well-being, psychological well-being. I have warm and supportive relationships. Life is getting better for people like me. I have a sense of purpose and meaning in my life. Most of those issues that you just raised, I like most parts of my personality. And you have to agree daily or almost every day to this. And so you have to have all three of these. You have to have no mental illness, you have to be happy or satisfied with your life, and you have to have social and psychological well-being, or you don't make this high cut. So now I take my qualitative questions of looking at people who seem inspiring to me, and I move it into a quantitative world with a big data set. So I'm so pleased Statistics Canada included this big questionnaire in a 2012 data set. So there were 20,000 plus Canadian community dwellers. It was a representative sample, and there was 5,222 older adults. Great response rate, almost 70%. And they used these great standardized questions about depression, anxiety. So when I say they don't have depression, they really don't have depression. These are great World Health Organization surveys. So that's to get that component of no mental illness, and then they've asked Corey Key's questions about flourishing, about happiness, etc. So the next question is, how are older adults doing? What do you think? I guess let's start with it. Percent in complete mental health. So this is a representative sample of Canadians. How many people 65 and under are in this high state of complete mental health? Happy or satisfied with their life, social well-being, psychological well-being, no mental illness in the last year? We're going to vote. So you have to commit to a number. Okay.
When was this done?
2012, so 4 years ago. All right, anyone want to throw out a number?
33%.
Okay, Raza?
20%.
20? Okay.
Let's say 30.
Okay.
50.
50. The optimist in the room. Anybody
15,
higher?
15.
15? Okay. So let's say under 20. Put your hands up. Vote what? Okay. All right. 20 to 39. 40 to 59. 60 plus? Okay, you want to see this?
Wow.
Wow, isn't that amazing? Because that's a pretty high standard,
Wow.
right?
Pretty amazing.
Now the question is, older adults, better or worse?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to vote on it. Okay, better. Worse. And the answer is, we don't know about it because people like myself have spent a heck of a lot of time looking at depression, anxiety, suicide, which is that 20% that's not there. They might not be doing terribly. They might be just happy only once a month, or fairly socially isolated, or some of these other things going on. But the question is, I was shocked. I was really surprised it was this high. The American data is way lower than this. They don't use exactly the same questions, and so I just have connected with a colleague in the States who's going to use this question on a statewide survey that she's got going. But the actual numbers in the States were like 25 or 30%. So to see us up to here in the 70s, either we're lying, or they're lying,
Or Canadian.
or we're Canadian. So, I could imagine the difference would be more now than it would have been in the recent past. So, all right. So when I took into account 22 possible moderators of this, and we'll go over what those moderators might be, the older adults had 55% higher odds of complete mental health than the ones under 65. And it's what we call a dose response. The least happy are the youngest, the 18 to 30. And then it goes up. The boomers are a little less, the younger boomers are a little less happy than the older adults. So we'll talk a little bit about what that might mean. But what do you think now? So now I take the people who are older. That was just the comparison between the older and younger. Now I take the people who are older and I say, okay, what characteristics might make a difference that brings you into this optimal state or keeps you in an optimal state? What do you think are the characteristics of those who have complete mental health or those who don't have it among older adults?
I think first of all, I'm not sure, but there are demographic changes. People are living longer.
Yeah.
So there's more of an opportunity for fulfillment. They're not struggling with family issues or finding jobs, or as the younger ones are, worried about economic worries, possibly It's a different quality of life, I think, with the demographic changes.
So the post-retirement world, when you, if you're fortunate enough, which the majority are, to own your own home, it's not as stressful perhaps. So the lower stress might be part of it?
Yes, and I heard the expression recently, freedom 85. Freedom 55.
Okay, all right, so that's a possibility. Marina, did you have something you wanted to throw in?
Social support, I would say, like a strong social support network.
So having us being socially isolated is very it makes you vulnerable. Okay, what else? Women or men, who do you think is doing better?
Women.
In the general population, if you look at like all ages, not just older adults, there is no difference between women and men, which is interesting. We would have thought there would have been, but we'll talk about it. Anybody else? All right, I'll tell you what came through. By the way, this is my godmother, who's 86. That was her 85th birthday. Apparently, if you want to live forever, you want to be Baptist, because she was the youngest one at this party with 50 people there. There we go. So women have among older adults, women have 39% higher odds of complete mental health than men. Physically active was key. And we know this from the experimental research too. If you're much less likely to succumb to depression at all ages, and if you are depressed, you're more likely to come out of depression if you are physically active. It just helps rewire your brains or protects your brains from depression and a variety of other things. So being physically active was really important, about 57% higher odds of complete mental health. What was very interesting was that individuals, again, these are all older adults who tend to be more religious and spiritual than younger people, but among older adults, those who turned to religion to cope with difficulties had 56% higher odds of complete mental health. So leaving religion and so on, and the person who always turns to religion or spirituality to cope was doing the best.
There's another aspect of that, perhaps, sense of community, because if you're going to church or synagogue or wherever, there's a community and you're connected.
Yeah, that is key, and people look out for each
as
other.
you're losing your network of family and friends, maybe community becomes more important.
Yeah, and now it's interesting, I haven't done I'm planning to do this study among older, always single individuals, and I'm sure that this can play a major role, because if you don't have someone tying you to the previous generation, as you get older, you can get siloed a little bit, and religious communities can make a big difference. Oop. Power source? We're out of powers. Oh. Is it possible we're not? Okay. So now you couldn't have, by definition, you can't be in complete mental health if you have addictions issues this year. Not surprisingly, if you've ever had substance abuse histories and you're having a hard time, you're more likely to turn to substance abuse as a coping strategy. And so those who had a history of substance abuse were 40% lower, had 40% lower odds of complete mental health. I think there's a couple of issues. One is, there's a recent study that came out and said that if they were looking at military people, so who had drank heavily in their early 20s, and they'd stopped drinking heavily by 30, but even by 45 they weren't doing as well. So there's two issues. One is that your brain's still developing and you're putting a toxic substance at high quantities into your brain, so that could be rewiring things. It could be also an early experience of substance abuse sets you off in a cascade of negative events, whether that's with respect to your career or your relationships falling apart. So even if you don't turn back to drinking, you may have not been able to build up the social capital that the other communities have. We don't know exactly what's going on, but those are our guesses. Married older adults have 26% higher odds than unmarried or divorced, but the next one is the key one. I love this picture. Isn't that fabulous? So those who had a confidant, this is what you were saying about social isolation, social support. Those who were isolated and had nobody that they could turn to talk about their deepest feelings. There's nobody who had their back, basically, were doing very poorly. But those with a confidant were 5 times as the odds of complete mental health. It was very, very hard. I forgot the exact number, but it was very, very hard to have any to find anyone who had no confidant and was flourishing. we are a social people, we are a social species, right?
But there is an issue there, isn't there, in terms of the direction of causality?
That if you're really depressed, you drive people away, perhaps, or
That
your
kind of thing.
yeah, or your perception of having
Or you
anybody
just-
could be wrong.
You just
Yes.
don't look for people and.
Yeah. I'm hoping, we don't currently have any prospective data, that's what I'd like to
Yeah.
see about that. But what Michael's raising is an important point, that certainly, not so much with anxiety or some of those other issues, but depression, you perceive that nobody loves you, nobody's there for you, even if they may be. So there's that
They can be a
possibility.
drag in terms of being.
Oh, you can drive people away too. It's hard to,
Yes.
it's hard to be, it's hard to be with somebody who's continually depressed, for
Mhm.
sure. Yes, Maria?
I was gonna say, these are really, like, very interesting and positive findings, given that perceptions of social support are usually more correlated with actual health and well-being, and I'm assuming these were objective.
That, well, they're,
Like availability of social support.
yeah, so
actual
it's there,
social
it's, but
support.
it's the respondent's perception that they have at least one person that they can turn to. And it was how, that they can turn to for support, basically.
Did you look into who those, were these people, the supportive people, family, friends?
I don't know.
Okay.
I
that's
don't know.
interesting.
And it's interesting because when you put them in the equation, married came out higher, but once you put married and confidant, it came it down, because sometimes the confidant was the married person. So, but you can see 26% higher versus 519% higher. The confidant is really the key issue, because people who have, even without a spouse, they have somebody they can turn to, makes a big difference. Our research ages ago said that, I was doing work that 20 years ago on chronic pain, and we found that your social support network wasn't that important when you weren't in chronic pain, but when you were in chronic pain, the level of depression went like this, that somebody without support went way up, and somebody with support sort of stayed the same. It was a huge buffer. So it depends a little bit what's facing them, but it seems to make a huge issue. So social support, being married and having a confidant, explained about 46% of the variation, 4.6% of the variation in mental health, complete mental health. That may not sound like a ton, but in 21 years and 100 papers, I've never had more than 30% explained, and that includes if you're looking at depression now and you had depression in the past, you know. So that's a fairly big chunk. Physical health characteristics, and I think we sometimes miss this, and Michael was getting to the point that you can have terrible physical health and still flourish. But not surprisingly, those with good to excellent health had 57% higher odds of complete mental health. Those in chronic pain had 17% lower odds. Chronic pain is a problem, but not as huge a problem as you might expect, considering, you know, if my back goes out, I'm not a happy camper, right? But those with chronic sleep problems had 36% lower odds of complete mental health, and those with functional limitations about 37% lower odds. So these issues we think of as fairly common in older adults, and they do explain about 6.5%. But remember, that's not that much more than just your social support network was almost as important as your pain. But I do want to say that if you're looking at a mental health issue in older adults, you need to consider how do we best manage their physical situation, because that's draining it. The chronic pain, all of those things. Don't forget, if your background is, you know, social work, psychology, don't forget that we need to get those attended to, because not surprisingly that they're pulling things down. So now this is it. So you couldn't currently in the past year have had anxiety disorders or depressive disorders, but if you'd at any point in your history had a major depressive disorder or a time of that, then your odds of complete mental health are quite a bit lower. Again, this might be partly that cascade effect of earlier life depression or earlier life anxiety setting things off, or perhaps making your social network too small. Or we don't know exactly what it is, but your vulnerability for depression and anxiety, which is one of the qualifications, you can't have depression and anxiety now, are considerably higher if you've had it in the past. So there's all those things going on. But cumulatively, all of these factors explained about 19% of the variation in complete mental health among Canadians aged 65 and over. So my conclusions for this first paper about older mental health, older adults and complete mental health, is one, they're more likely to be in complete mental health than younger adults, and the rates are high, almost 4 in 5. I think this is like the best good news story to get out. I don't think that's how people perceive aging, particularly those who are fearful of growing older. They think of it as being a negative time in life, but that it's better and that it's so many are doing well is exciting. So that the current physical health and social support and history of mental illness are key factors in older adults. And that Corey Key's scale, so this is the first paper I worked on, but Corey's Key scale is highly reliable. I didn't go into all those details. It worked really well with this huge sample, and it works in large surveys. And that interventions to improve social support, friendly visiting program, those types of things can really make a difference, or potentially can, because confidant is such a key issue. But we also need to think about decreasing pain, insomnia, and disability, and all of these are holding promises for improvement.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So are you saying that you were able to account for 19% of the variance?
Yes.
And so the question obviously that comes to mind is, you know, do we know nothing about the other 80%? Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, but you know, that's totally normal for social science research because people are so variable that almost nobody doing any analysis.
So like you said, you're doing well if you can count for 30%.
No, 30 is the best I've ever had in
Right,
110
exactly.
papers.
But
15% is normal, 20 is not
We're not
bad.
even getting close to that with all those different sort of clusters of factors.
So there's all kinds of other things we don't know what. And also I have to be able to get them in this secondary data analysis.
We're not
So
asking about them all.
well, I don't even know what to ask yet. That's where we should brainstorm at the
Exactly,
end
yeah.
about what else should be in those types of surveys that could make a difference. These are very big surveys, but they're for a variety of purposes, not just ours.
So for example, I don't want
Yeah.
to hog the thing. For example, did the survey, I'm sure the survey did look at socioeconomic status.
Oh, yeah, I've got income in there. That's adjusting for income and education. That's adjusting for income, education, age, race, sex, marital status, confidant, history of depression, history of anxiety disorders, history of suicidality, history of substance abuse problems, and there must have been another 6. I just can't remember what they are.
I would have bet that socioeconomic status, you know, would have accounted for 20% of the variance.
Oh, no, it was under 1.
We're talking about social determinants of health these
well,
days,
no,
right?
well, if you're looking at income and education, now remember, I don't have your childhood
Right.
income or your adult, I just have your current income, but I'm comparing it. If you put income and education, neither one came through, I don't think. But they'll come through in the immigrant study a little bit. Hold on to the
Okay.
immigrant study, but they're not a big factor. But
Really?
because from a social determinants of health, these purchased other things. These purchased social relationships. These purchased
Well, that's
lower
why I'm
stress
thinking-
level.
That's exactly why I'm thinking that.
Yeah,
by
but
itself-
the other variables I put in the equation might have taken that into account.
Yeah, so it's taken that, extracted that, but
Yeah.
you just put in this.
There are, I mean, in the general population, if you look from the poorest to the richest are more likely to be in complete mental health, but it's not a huge difference.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah, sorry?
There is a variable called negative social interaction in the CCHS mental health 2012 with gender and race and age that only explains around 5% on distress, and that's less for positive mental health.
But negative interactions are huge.
Huge, it's more huge on distress than on positive mental health. I think social support has a larger effect on positive mental health than negative social interaction, but negative social interaction actually.
Yeah, it totally makes sense, because
Because
if you
negative
have
social
that.
support, right, it's almost negative.
Yeah, no, I'd love to talk to you more about this afterwards, because it sounds like we've got some mutual interests, but I just want to talk to you about a paper that Carl Pilmer put together, and the title of it was great, which is you're never happier than your least happy child. So, and they actually have really good evidence. They've been doing a whole body of work on this, so that if your child is not doing well, whether that's a measure of negative social interaction or you're just worried about them, they're not doing well, that really pulls you down. And similarly, if you have a really conflictual relationship, I certainly can see it pulling you down. But for building you up, having a confidant is key too. I think I have self-reported stress in there. This is, do you see these cute kids? They're 8 sisters who were Dutch, who immigrated shortly after the war. So I could have taken a picture from anywhere, but I grew up in Eastern Ontario, and there's a huge Dutch settlement of people who came after the war. Because of the war, a lot of the area had flooded, so the farmers didn't have farms, so 185,000 came to Canada. So these little girls are now part of our older immigrant sample. But I'm just going to talk to you a little bit and see what you know. We're going to vote on this one too. So what percentage of older adults 65 and over are immigrants? Throw out some numbers.
Where though, in Toronto or?
No, on Canada. Why?
30%.
30? What?
40.
40? Toronto would be higher, but you're right on the button. 30%, so 1.36 million of our 4.5 million older adults are immigrants. So the next question is, what percentage of older adults are visible minorities? So not immigrants, just visible minorities in general.
In Canada.
In Canada, across Canada, not just Toronto. Remember, Toronto is quite a different picture, right?
5%.
15?
10.
Any other bidders?
Oh, 25.
75%.
Okay, 10. So 10%. But what's interesting, so 10% of older adults are visible minorities, much smaller than the younger population. So, but that's still 500,000. But what's interesting is 95% of those are immigrants. So in fact, among older adults, there's only like 22,000 older adults who are visible minority that were born here. It was unbelievably white in Canada 75 years ago. It was a completely different world. It's hard for me to imagine, but like there's only 22,000. It's amazing. Of course, now visible minority, according to the census, does not include our First Nations. So these are our other racialized groups, right? So here's the research objective, which is to identify the prevalence of complete mental health among Canadian immigrants aged 55 and older. So it's a little bit younger I did, partly because I needed those immigrants, and the younger you go, the more you get. And to determine factors associated with it. So this is a subgroup. There's 9,500 who were 55 and over. And in this group, 7,900 were non-immigrants, and I was trying to get a picture of recent immigrants, which there are very few older adults who are recent immigrants. I had thought there would be more because of family reconciliation. You can bring, or is it that? Sponsor. You can sponsor your older adults, and I've interviewed in the Chinese community grandparents who came over to raise grandchildren and things like that, but there's not very many. And then we had 1,500 long-term immigrants, so they've been here 20 years or more. So here we go. Now these are 55 and over. Where do you think we are in here? Who's doing best? Non-immigrants, recent immigrants, or long-term immigrants?
Recent immigrants are the best.
Recent are the best, do you think?
I think long term.
You think long-term? How about those non-immigrants, those born here? All right, we're going to vote. Okay, non-immigrants. Okay, recent immigrants. Long-term immigrants. Yes, let's have a look. So non-immigrants, it's about 76%. Recent immigrants is basically the same. That's not statistically different. But your long-term immigrants are coming in higher. Now these numbers are a little lower than we saw before because remember we're including 55. The before in the general population it was 65 and over, and that's why they're a little higher. So in all, when we adjusted for 13 potential risk factors, long-term immigrants had about 21% higher odds of complete mental health than their peers who were not immigrants, who were born here. So this is where money came in, but it wasn't a huge factor. So Michael, it did not come through in the general population, but among immigrants, if you earn over $80,000 a year, you have 76% higher odds of complete mental health than those with less than 20,000. What I was surprised is it wasn't what we call a dose response, because under 20 is hard to it's hard to survive. So I would have thought 20 to 39 would have been doing better, etc. But here it was really a divide between the rich and the poor. it didn't seem to, the middle categories didn't differentiate particularly from the four. But again, it may be that the people earning more than 80,000 were younger, healthier, higher educated, like all of those things together may be playing out a little bit. So not surprisingly, if you were without a functional limitation, you're more than twice as likely to be in complete mental health compared to those with those limitations. If you were without chronic pain, you're 50% more likely to be in complete mental health than those with chronic pain. If you have chronic insomnia, or you're without chronic insomnia, you're almost 3 times more likely. And I've been playing with that because chronic insomnia might be a symptom of depression, which is one of the characteristics. So it might be not the, I don't know which way it goes exactly. I've tried it with and without insomnia. Insomnia is important. And we know that if you're not sleeping well, life is not as happy. But whether it goes both ways. So I may have over-specified my model. It might not be perfect. So physical health explained 9.3% of the variation, which is considerably more than in the general population. And here's some other factors. So current physical health and marital status, you're more likely to have complete mental health. Those with a confidant, again, 5 times the odds of complete mental health. Those with a substance abuse are less likely to be in complete mental health. But I think this has implications on interventions to improve social support, decrease chronic pain, address insomnia, and to decrease disability level. What I was showing was simply an observational study. So I said people who have these characteristics are more at risk. I don't know, I can't guarantee that if you can improve those characteristics, people's mental health. But it seems to me social support, chronic pain, insomnia, disability, we should be working on those anyway, even if it didn't come out. And my guess is that they are somewhat drivers of the experience. So this is a paper we've already published. It came out a year ago now with Philip Baden, who is one of our doctoral students and has a long-term interest in suicide, and I have an interest in complete mental health. So we wanted to look at people who had been suicidal, so had seriously considered suicide at some point in their life, and there was 2,800 of these in my sample. And we were trying to figure out how many reached complete mental health now. So what do you think? What percentage of formerly suicidal, seriously suicidal people are now flourishing, happy, satisfied, sense of purpose, warm and supportive relationships, no mental illness, no suicidal thoughts, no addictions? I never ask rhetorical questions. Well, throw out some numbers.
10%.
Well, not 38.
Oh, wow.
This is so it's great that you write a paper and the newspaper title is "There's Hope at the End of the Tunnel," those types of things. 38%. And remember, if you said you were only happy once a week, you got thrown out of my complete mental health category. So I wanted to show you that doesn't mean that 62% are still depressed and suicidal. In fact, 72% of all the formerly suicidal had zero suicidal thoughts in the last year. So that 38% means that they are the real flourishing subgroup, but that's not to mean that there's a large group, equally large group in the middle that are doing well, but just not wowee fabulous kind of thing. So what does this mean? It's interesting, Michael and I have been talking a lot about it. I have grave concerns about the push to extend the assisted suicide to the mentally ill. Currently, I just went to a workshop, Michael and I were at the same workshop on Sunday talking about the reappraisal about the MAID, medical assistance in dying, to include people who do not have a terminal illness but have only a mental health diagnosis. And I'm terrified about that because to me, when you talk about a clinical symptom of depression, that is the wish to die. That's what, like if you look in the DSM-5, that's one of the diagnostic criteria. So that people cannot imagine, and if you talk to somebody in deep depression, they can't even remember ever being happy in the past, and they certainly cannot imagine ever being happy in the future. That is part of the diagnosis. So that somebody is going to potentially be coming to a health professional with a deep heartily felt wish to die, and we're going to take that as a reasonable discussion. And seriously, that is on the table right now and being discussed seriously. So I just want to raise that. I feel really dramatically concerned about the mental well-being of people with mental illness coming and asking for this. Anyway, so in general, what are factors associated with higher complete mental health among formerly suicidal? Being older, again, with time, I think it's probably partly that with age, everything comes into perspective. You're going to get through this, those types of things. Being a woman, having a higher income, turning to spirituality or religion to cope with problems. And those with a confidant had 7 times the odds of complete mental health. So this may well be a subpopulation that typically is more isolated. So if it was 5 times in the older adult population, here it's 7 times as important, which I think is really important as we think through potential interventions. So not surprisingly, lower complete mental health are those with chronic pain, insomnia, history of alcohol dependence. So I just wanted to talk in the last minute or two about some other projects I have going away. And we're going on with, I have a wonderful group of graduate students who are working with me on a variety of things. But one of them is we're looking at complete mental health in different subpopulations. So the older widows is really interesting because we've always known that widows do way better than widowers on almost everything. They live longer, they're happier, they just seem to do a lot better than widowed men, widowers. And when I did the analysis, I found exactly the same thing, that the widowers were doing worse than the widows, but I only looked at people who had lost a spouse. But a lot of it was driven by one factor. Can you guess what it is? The men were at a disadvantage because of one factor. Pardon?
Laundry.
Nobody fed them. Well, that's a positive. Malnutrition. That wasn't why I don't have that.
Social connection, maybe.
Well, so we'd always thought it was going to be social connection because there is a literature that when you the wife is often not only the husband's best friend, but also their social coordinator. So that's what we'd expected, and that's what the literature typically said. I only have the measure of confidant, and that didn't seem to drive it. So it may or may not be. But was one factor that you do think of as being more associated with men than women? History of substance abuse. So these guys may have had a confidant, but it may have been that it was a lubricated discussion sort of thing that you go fishing. But so if they didn't have a history of substance abuse, even if they weren't currently turning to substance abuse to cope with it, it was problematic. That was that might be reflective of some coping strategies, or it might reflect social networks. We don't know exactly what's going on. We're still working on it. 20% of people who have pain that prevents them from doing most activities, who are still able to be happy and functioning and feel they have a sense of purpose and no mental illness, they're still doing amazingly well. Now, cancer patients, we did this with a doctoral student, Carrie West, and we were looking at cancer patients and cancer survivors, and then people who've never had cancer. Now, not surprisingly, if you currently have cancer, your level of complete mental health is lower. But if you were a survivor, it cast no shadow. You were doing as well as people who never had it. You bounced back to your baseline. Well, I don't know if it's your baseline, but you bounced back to the same level as people who never had this serious disease. So Melissa Redmond, who is a former doctoral student, who's a prof at University of Carleton, she and I are working on people who've had substance abuse dependence issues, because that seems to be so key as a predictor. We're trying to see who among people with a substance dependence problem. So by definition, you can't have a substance dependence problem now to qualify, but you also have to be happy and functioning and all of these other things. So we're trying to get our head around this. This one we published, this was with Senyo, who's a master's student, and then 2 colleagues of mine at University of Albany and the University of Iowa, looking at people who had been clinically depressed in the past. And 39% of them were in complete mental health. So about the same as people who've been suicidal. And again, that doesn't mean that they're depressed, it just means that they had to be at this super high level. Similar types of things came through, but what was very interesting was that even people who had been depressed for a period of 2 or more years, which we think of as major long-term depression, were equally as likely to recover as people who had shorter, like 2-month depressions, recover to this optimal state. And then I have a small grant, I have a grant with SHIRK to look at, with Deb Goodman and Barb Fallon, to look at survivors of childhood maltreatment. Childhood sexual abuse survivors, childhood physical abuse survivors, and about 50% of them are in complete mental health. Which is, I've been working a lot on the negative consequences, but to see that so many people can survive and thrive and flourish is fantastic. And then one of the things I'm most exciting with is a small grant with Rose Cameron, who's an Anishinaabe woman who's a former doctoral student at our school and who teaches at Algoma. And we're looking at First Nations Canadians off reserve. So, okay, so First Nations Canadians off reserve, what percentage do you think are in complete mental health?
10.
Any other options? Anybody else voting? And if you look at the news, 10 would be the right number,
Yeah.
but it's not.
I know 1/3 of them are distressed. Above the 9 cutoff point taken, so 1/3 of them would not be in optimal health.
But in fact, 65% are in complete mental health. 2/3 were in complete mental health. I don't have distress in mine, but I have that you had a major depressive disorder, no major depressive disorder, no anxiety disorder, no suicidal thoughts in the last year, no addictions to drugs or alcohol, happiness, social well-being. And so Rose's comment on is, we don't see this reflected in the literature. We don't see it in the media. We only see not that those are not worthy of attention, they are, but we have so many resources inside the community that are not getting any attention. So that's, the other thing I learned is that researchers are happier when they study complete mental health rather than mental illness. And thanks for being here. So I'm totally aware that some people need to run right now, but I'm open to stay for a few minutes and answer questions as well. Phyllis.
I have a question about, you mentioned interventions to improve social supports.
Yeah.
What are some interventions, aside from, you mentioned friendly visiting?
Yeah.
So that's something the community can organize? What
Well,
else do you-
so there's the potential. I mean, I actually should pass it over to Raza, who's been working on age-friendly communities. So talk about some of the interventions that are happening that not necessarily, I'm saying you're socially isolated and you should go to this program, but some of the types of things that are happening.
To improve social support.
Yeah.
You know, it's a wide array of things that are happening in the city, but I'll give you an example of something that they're really focusing on right now. One of the things that the city is trying to promote is congregate dining, and using areas where older adults congregate to eat to promote social engagement and social support. Something that we may not think about in research, but that's one of the ways.
Yeah, and you're not pathologizing anyone saying, oh, you're isolated, I want to find you a friend. It's like, hey, come on down for our dinner, and then when you have a good quality facilitator, you can say, oh, you haven't met so-and-so, and just kind of keeping an eye out of people. But there's no pathologizing going on about what's that.
And places of worship are being used more for that than as a specific theme for a place of worship.
So I think there's way more creative things, and we as social workers, or speaking for myself, we often think of an individual solution for an individual problem. But how can we just make community more likely? Thanks for coming.
Actually, in the Jewish community, there is a project run by the Bernard Vittel Center where they're going into buildings and they're creating programs in apartment buildings. So they're bringing people out of their units and they're meeting each other and making social connections, and also they're enjoying the activity.
Absolutely, and in fact, some of the co-op housing has designed for older adults. They have a central. They have people like CCA workers and things like that, but they have a central congregate location, and they do little workshops, and they have bingo, and they have they just have social activities. So just to make it a little easier for people to join in and not have to organize and not have to get out of their building and all of those things. I think we can think outside the box, and there are some creative ways. Canada's doing a pretty good job right now. I mean, those are very high percentages. So what are we doing, and how can we make it better?
But there are also people who, there are some people who are very social and they enjoy
Yeah.
these things, and others who throughout their lives, they have not participated in these kinds of programs. And as their social circle diminishes with age, losing friends, they become isolated, or more isolated, and they're not accustomed to going out to a community center or a group program, or
So even say the Community Care Access Center suggests that you are eligible for 4 hours of cleaning a week.
Right,
even.
yes.
Well, just by putting the same worker in
Yeah,
week
there's
after
a
week,
relationship.
you build a relationship, even though it's around cleaning. And you know, how do you screen the people that are coming? You screen them to have good social skills, to be careful.
They
and
become
etc.
confidants, by the way.
And they become confidants, absolutely. But if administratively you say, oh, well, you know, rotate them around all the time, it doesn't work. So I think we can think creatively about how this will work. So Zara and then Raza?
Yes, I was just going to ask, so you've identified a lot of very key things that, you know, for me, in terms of, like complete mental health, what it looks like, right? Is there a pocket tool that has been developed for, say, caregivers or family members who see elderly kind of, you know, we're not doctors, we don't want to diagnose anybody, but is there like a complete mental health pocket tool which identifies all these characteristics of complete mental health that a caregiver or a family member can use to assess whether or not their family member needs help or not?
Oh, yeah. I guess because there's no pocket tool, but it wouldn't, at least the component, not the lack of mental illness component, but the happiness, life satisfaction, that's only, cumulatively, that's only 13, 14 questions, something like that. So you could put that together. It would promote good discussions about where there's gaps. So, one of the questions is, I have a sense of purpose and meaning in your life. So there could promote a discussion. If they say never, okay, let's just talk about that. What can we do to help you? You know, it potentially could be used. As with most of our practice, most of the tools are around illness, not around optimal well-being. So we're worried about getting people from depressed to not depressed, but this is going from neutral to thriving, and I don't think we've thought it through. So I don't know who would have it, but maybe as a conversation starter, the sense that I have a sense that I have warm and supportive relationships. I like both parts of my personality. Those are some of the questions that are in there. So they would be good discussion starters. I hadn't really thought about it. I'm not sure who would want to use it. Like if we could get family members to use it as a prompt kind of thing, that's a possibility. I was just taking it back as a sort of a State of the Union address kind of thing, as in how are we doing, who's vulnerable, but I haven't got to that stage yet of thinking about it as an I think we've identified areas of intervention, but I haven't thought about that. Maria.
I'll be really quick. So the other program that I wanted to talk about, we talked about a discussion we had at Age Friendly panel. I'm not sure if you were there, when it was myself and Sandra and Andrea from the city talking, but we were discussing about how the city has been using paramedics to help break up social isolation. So certain areas in the city and certain buildings were identified as making a lot of emergency calls when it was non-emergency because the people were socially isolated or feeling depressed or lonely. And so what they had non-emergency personnel go into the buildings. They received a small grant to do this and go in and check in on people. And then not only did they do that, but they started to connect people within the building together. So that was one of the other ways that they started to address that. My question about this particular talk is about the confidants. One of the things that I know from reading about confidants is that women, most of the time, don't identify their spouse as the confidant, and men will identify their spouse as the confidant.
Mhm.
Can
I speak to that?
yeah,
Yeah, I put it in the equation, I mean, just statistically, I put it in the equation, I didn't look for an interaction effect or
Okay.
not. It came through really strongly, so it probably was important for both.
okay.
But I think just sort of sociologically pulling back,
Mhm.
is that women are willing to be vulnerable with other women,
Mhm.
and men are not willing to be vulnerable with other men. So men tend to have friends who are males, and their major female friend would be their spouse. And so that tends to be able to confide in feeling less than adequate about something is more likely to happen with a spouse. So I think that'll come through. I haven't finished the widower paper yet, widower paper. I think that'll come through. But as I said, confidant didn't seem to explain the differences, but I think I might have a drinking buddy or a fishing buddy that I don't necessarily, as a male, I don't necessarily bring my deepest sorrows to, while the woman might be willing to do that with her sister or her pal or whatever.
Just to add to that, it also might be that this confidant the woman has is a longer term confidant, and then if the widower loses the spouse, then it's a hard transition to have your friends or your social friends be your confidant.
Because you never really
Because you
related
haven't had
that
that
way.
relationship.
Yeah, I think there's more to that, and I think I need to look at that. And also, I'm amazed that anybody without a confidant can be in complete mental health. So I probably should look at that very interesting subgroup and say, well, how can you be flourishing when you're totally isolated? Because I think of humans as being extraordinarily social, and we shrivel and die without social support. But maybe it's not that they're isolated, it's that it's something about them willing to share, as opposed that there aren't really people around that would provide that. I don't really know what's going on.